Hi, and welcome. My name is Dr. Steve Broskowski, and I'm from Misericordia University. And welcome to Introduction to Instructional Design. This video represents the first week's online class of the course EDU553, Principles of Instructional Design. In this video, let's consider what is instructional design, and let's get a brief introduction to the field. Then let's take a closer look at what instructional design is about. Let's look at one of the models of instructional design as an introduction, and that's called the ADDIE model. And then to round out, let's conclude today's class by considering our remote assignments that will be due by next week. So let's begin our exploration into the field of instructional design by asking the question, what is instructional design and what is the field all about? Let's begin our exploration by starting with the definition offered by Robert Merrill and several other researchers. They say that instructional design, also known as instructional systems design, is the practice of creating instructional experiences that make the acquiring of knowledge and skills more efficient, more effective, and more appealing to our students. Many people who take this course at Misericordia are either already teachers or aspiring to be teachers. So at this point you might be thinking, how does instructional design compare with how teachers prepare instruction for face-to-face instructional delivery? Keep that thought in mind, and we're going to explore that as we continue exploring instructional design and the process of it throughout this class meeting. The Distance Learning Resource Network goes farther and delineates specific steps that they suggest should be included in the process of designing instruction if you're going to truly consider it instructional design. Those steps include starting by defining a problem or a gap in knowledge. In other words, what the learners can do currently and what they're unable to do, and that's what this particular bit of instruction is meant to address. Another step is to define the audience carefully so that we can design instruction for them. Another step is to develop objectives and then assessment strategies to make sure that we are meeting those objectives. And also to select and sequence content and learning activities and then evaluate them, and then after that go back and revise to ensure that the instruction is designed well. Finally, I went to a third source to compare definitions for you. I went to Wikipedia to see how would they describe to the layperson what instructional design is all about. And they start off sounding like Merrill and his contemporaries. They say that instructional design is the practice of arranging media and content to help learners and teachers transfer knowledge in a very effective and efficient way. So that sounds like Merrill. The process consists broadly of determining the current state of the learner understanding, so that involves understanding the audience and assessing their abilities in terms of this content, defining the end goal of instruction, so there's objectives and a goal, and then creating some media-based intervention, so to speak, to assist in that transition from not knowing to knowing. So let's take a deeper look at it. Where did instructional design really come from? How was it developed? And how does it relate to what teachers do in their classroom day to day? Instructional design traces its origins back to the late 1930s through about 1945-ish. In other words, during World War II. Consider that during World War II, the United States of America encountered an instructional problem. Here, they were assembling large groups of military personnel, and needed to accurately and consistently train all of these people in a very efficient way in a very short period of time. So, how can you ensure that all of the military personnel get the same type of training and in the most efficient manner? We're looking at training such as how to work with different weapons, tanks, guns, and other procedures. A good way to do that would be to design instruction in a very careful and particular way. So instructional design actually began with World War II. Because instructional design was proven to be so effective as military were trained during World War II, the field started to grow and was supported by a number of different activities. For example, from the 1950s and onward, we had people like B.F. Skinner developing ideas on behaviorism and how people learn more effectively. Many teachers are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of learning that shows how learners move from one level of learning and can scaffold up and move to greater heights with deeper learning of the content. Robert Gagne's conditions of learning and Dick and Carey's famous model of instructional design that really outlines how people learn and how we can design instruction to be most effective and most efficient. And then in the 1980s and beyond, with the advent and then the evolution of computer technology, that opened up a whole new vista of ways to deliver instruction more effectively to people, and the need for instructional design for distance learning purposes increased even more. To examine the history of instructional design a little better, let's take a look at a timeline. On the screen now you can see the credit for the timeline that I'm about to look at with you, and it's located on a tool called tikitalki.com. So let's enter. So when we look at the history of instructional design, in this timeline, it's starting back in the early 1900s and talking specifically about instructional film in schools and like around 1910 and beyond. And then the AV, the audiovisual instructional movement, starting in the 20s and moving through the 40s. Then we find, as we've already discussed, that instructional design originates in World War II. So we find that in the early 1940s. And then we find that instructional design starts to make its way in different ways into public schools. And we find instructional television in the 50s. We find different theories and models like programmed instruction. We find different research into instructional design elements like criterion reference testing and the conditions of learning and the creation of behavioral objectives. And then we find that computerized technology starts to emerge, and with it, instructional design as a field and a science starts to grow even more. It starts to get to be applied in those directions. For example, in computer-aided or assisted instruction and computer-based training, CBT. Instructional design models started to be developed in the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s as well. And then in the 1980s, personal computers emerged, and then they found their way into schools. So what is instructional design, and how does it differ from what teachers do in the classroom on a day-to-day basis? I'm going to take you out to a website called Instructional Design Central, and I like this website because it is a good conglomeration of a series of instructional design related definitions. So first, they begin with the question, what is instructional design? And they talk about it's a process by which learning takes place and through which learning is designed to be delivered. And they talk about various terms that are sometimes used interchangeably or very much related terms. Terms like instructional technology, learning experience design, curriculum design, ISD, instructional systems design, as well as just the term instructional design itself. And I like on this website because they have done a very good job at locating and pulling these definitions from a variety of very good sources. So here you'll see that talking about instructional design, they're beginning by looking at the work of people like Merrill and talking about how it's a systematic process to develop education and training. And that's a really good definition of it, a very simple, straightforward definition. And then looking at educational technology and the newer science of learning experience. Now we'll go a little further. What is an instructional designer? An instructional designer is basically somebody who applies these systematic methods based on theory and research and practice in order to design effective and reliable instruction, as Merrill had described. An instructional technologist is somebody who specifically works with technology and evaluates new technologies to see how they can better improve and enhance instruction. And also an educational technologist, which is a very similar term to instructional technologist. So when you consider what we've learned about instructional design thus far and compare it to what teachers do in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, we find that the design process involves starting by analyzing. And we analyze both the audience and the content, and then we design the instruction. Then we build some type of technology-based training solution, and then we have to test that solution and redesign it as needed based on the results of that testing that we do. And after we redesign as needed, then we deliver the instruction to the actual learners. In the day-to-day classroom environment, we design and we also deliver. Now realize that the analysis of the learners, that's something in the day-to-day classroom, of course, teachers, we get to know our students, and we don't have to necessarily at that time analyze them intentionally because we've already done that. But if you consider that element added in, we're still looking at analyze, design, and then deliver. And we're still missing some of the other elements that are present in typical instructional design settings. Now let's turn our attention for a moment to a very important question, and that is, as we look at different avenues of online learning, whether they're formal or informal avenues, the question is everything that we see there instructionally effective? With the advent of different online technologies, people can learn from so many different sources. But the question is, including television itself, the question is it really effective? As one of our follow-up activities and our debriefing activities as part of week 1 of this course, I'm going to present you with a video in which Robert Merrill comments on the effectiveness of computer-based instruction and considers how instruction is in today's world, considering all of the opportunities we have. And he attempts to answer this question. So let's consider what constitutes effective instruction. When we look at this world full of technology-based learning opportunities, are these different media instructionally effective for learners? Think about YouTube videos. Are they instructionally effective? Sometimes. You can certainly glean some information out of them, but it all depends how they're designed. So I would say maybe on that. About Khan Academy or TED Talks. These videos typically tend to be higher quality in terms of the content, but when the presentation is finished, will students have really learned a lot from those other than gaining a couple of points? Maybe. About a podcast or any type of audio lecture? It's a definite maybe. How about if a learner is reading a web page, or even more traditionally reading a chapter in a book? Will they necessarily learn from that material, from that medium? Maybe. How about if we consider some online training module? Maybe, and I would say here, hopefully, depending how it's designed. I love watching shows on the History Channel or Discovery Channel or channels of that nature. And many of those are touted to be educational programs, and indeed, any watcher can glean some information as they watch those shows. But again, are they effectively in terms of instruction? Is it a high likelihood that learners will be able to retain a large amount of the material that was presented? Maybe, but not necessarily. It doesn't mean that these are not good sources of information, but it depends if what your purpose is. If it's for entertainment purpose, if it's to learn bits and pieces of things, compared to when we talked about the World War II military situation, where the instruction needed to be high quality. We needed to get as much learning out of that material as we possibly could, or else people might be in jeopardy, and lives could be in jeopardy in that case. When we look at it from that lens, usually these media that we're presenting here are not very effective instructionally. Anytime that a learner approaches a technology-facilitated learning opportunity, do these educational media do these types of things? Do they introduce the objectives of what is to be presented and learned? Sometimes. Do they help the learners recall prerequisite information and thus trigger learning and to support meta-analysis of what the learner knows and doesn't know, so the learner can determine what must be unlearned and what needs to be learned in its place? Sometimes, but a lot of times not. Do they present new information? Yeah, definitely, absolutely they do. Do they have learners apply or practice information and give feedback? No, in those media, usually not. Do they tend to test learner acquisition of the content that was just presented? No, usually not. Do they help learners apply skills learned to new situations and show them how to transfer those skills? No, usually not. And finally, do they help learners see how what they learned fits into a larger context of learning? Maybe, but again, usually not. Let's compare to what Merrill says in his first Principles of Instruction. Merrill states that the most effective learning environments are based in problems. They're problem-based. In other words, the learner has to do something and solve some kind of a problem in order to apply learning and, again, to make that learning very effective. Also, Merrill says that effective instruction involves the student participating in 4 distinct phases of learning. In the beginning, we have to activate their prior experience. Then the student has to demonstrate the skills that are being learned and apply those skills and integrate those skills into real-world situations if we want the instruction to truly be effective. This leads us to a comparison of two different thoughts in the world of education in the classroom: training versus education. So I went to two general sources to look at how different sources would describe these concepts to the layperson. I went to Wikipedia and dictionary.com. So what is training? Training is the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and competencies as a result of the teaching of vocational or practical skills and knowledge that relate to specific useful competencies. In other words, training involves looking at real-world skills, things that are necessary in order to accomplish certain tasks in a very practical way. Now let's compare education. Education is the act or process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge, developing the powers of reasoning and judgment, and generally preparing intellectually for a more mature life. I like that definition too. Because when we look at education, we're looking at that larger view. In both cases, students are being presented with information. Learners are trying to acquire that information, and ideally they want to be able to remember that information and to be able to apply it in very practical ways after the content has been learned. But when we consider training, we're looking at a very specific set of skills, and the whole purpose is to know those particular skills. In the world of education, we would like the learner to not only get those skills, but also to understand, how did we get to those skills? What do you do with those skills? Why do you need to know those skills? I would contend that in the classroom, we certainly provide some training because we want learners to know what steps to take in order to solve some problem or satisfy some situation. But I would suggest further that in the classroom, we look at the process of educating, because it would be very helpful for the learner to understand the why and how we develop this and why we should be involved in this. Let's take a look at a quick example. In each of the scenarios pictured here, whether you're washing clothes or you're changing a tire on a car, or you're taking safety precautions such as washing your hands and dealing with other aspects of cleanliness to prevent the spread of a pandemic disease, we could probably accomplish what we need in terms of learning by giving some training. Now, education would even be better. When you think about it, in the world of washing your clothes, well, there are certain clothes you have to wash together, certain separately, and there are very good reasons for that. The reasons part comes from the education. What happens if the learner knows the specific steps, but now cannot reason which clothes to separate and why to do these things and how to do them? In other words, apply them in different situations. And even further, at a higher level, will the learner at some point be tempted to just throw away all of that training and chuck everything into the washer at the same time? Well, there'll be bad consequences that will come from that, as anyone who's ever tried it can tell you. When you're changing the tire on a car, it's good to know the exact steps in which order to take them, and that's very valuable. But if we educate and go beyond that, why do you need to make sure your parking brake is on? And why do you need to make sure you're in park before you start this process? And so on. Again, if the learner is educated to that level, not only does he or she understand the steps, but they understand why, and they can apply this information for safety at a much higher degree. In times of pandemic, and we're talking about how to wash your hands, well, many people may have decided not to do this because they were not educated into why and how and what happens if you don't do this. So again, when we're looking at training versus education, I would contend that even in the classroom, we do a little bit of both. But both are needed, because to have training without the education part is not helpful. So, what are some of the major components of this systematic way of designing instruction? Here I've listed some of the major components as a brief overview. An instructional designer will begin by performing a needs assessment. In other words, what kind of instruction is needed? What are the needs of the learners in that particular situation? As a classroom teacher, you have the privilege and opportunity to get to know your students well, and you can tailor instruction directly for them. But consider that if you're designing instruction to meet the needs of learners whom you may never meet, that provides certain challenges. So a second step in instructional design process is to perform a learner analysis. For whom is this program or this instructional prototype being developed? What are the characteristics? How do they learn best? What are their preferences? Then we have to really analyze the task at hand. If you're in the classroom, you have the opportunity to gauge learners' understanding and see if they're frustrated or not just by watching their faces and hearing their comments and being able to gauge the kinds of questions that they're going to ask. But how about if you're preparing instruction to be delivered to an audience that you may never meet? Well, you better have the task down very clearly so that you can teach it very effectively. So task analysis is a very major component of good systematic instructional design. Based on the task analysis, a designer will form objectives, and there'll be very specific objectives as to what the learner will be able to complete when he or she finishes this module of instruction. Then, because there are so many different modes of instructional delivery, a designer should spend some time in doing some good media selection. What are the most effective methods and most effective media for delivering this instruction to those particular learners in that particular situation? And finally, we need to evaluate. And we have to evaluate in two ways. Number one, we certainly want to evaluate how the students have learned and acquired that material. We know that in the teaching world as assessment. But we also have to evaluate the educational product itself. How can we tweak it? How can we improve it? How can we make learning more effective and more efficient? So as you're probably able to determine at this point in our analysis of instructional design and examining what it is and comparing the difference between what teachers do on a day-to-day basis in the classroom versus an instructional designer, you've probably come up to this determination already, that at the heart of instructional design is analysis. And designers sometimes call this the front-end analysis. In other words, all the work we have to put in, we're front-loaded, so to speak, with more heavy work right at the beginning before we ever begin to set out to actually teach something. And if your instructional product is either going to fail or not be as effective as it could be, it's probably going to have something to do with the fact that you did not do a thorough enough analysis. So let's take an overview of some of those front-end analysis pieces. When an instructional designer sets out to design systematically instruction, the designer performs that front-end analysis after we look at the learners and we examine the task and we look at the need for training, and then we look at the media that could be used and what's most appropriate and so on, all of these different tasks. This can lead to the development of what's called a high-level design document. In other words, a proposal that if you were to meet with someone in the military or someone in any training environment like a company and say, I'm going to propose to conduct this kind of training and design it, that you would then present them with a document. That document is known as the high-level design document. The second step would involve actually implementing. And again, if you're a classroom teacher, you would be doing that implementation on a day-to-day basis, unless it was a special project. But if you're going to sell training, if you will, if you're going to sell your idea to anyone in whether it's public school, through companies, through military, you would then have to show and give an example of what your instructional modules would look like. So what you would do is create a prototype, something that would be a small portion, a little nugget of instruction, but then you would be able to demonstrate how effective your instructional module would be. In this course, we're going to do both of these. The first half of the course will focus on the planning end, leading to a high-level design document. And then the second half, or a little bit less than the second half, will be the implementation. We will actually design an educational prototype that we could share along with our high-level design document to try to get try to sell our idea, if you will. When you're systematically designing instruction, there are a lot of decisions to make, and ideally the designer wants to make those decisions with respect to the particular training environment and a particular learners in which they're going to hope to engage with this particular instructional module. Just consider the forms of delivery that are available. We can do computer-based training. It could be online, could be delivered on CD-ROM or download. We have web-based. We could do audio podcasting. We could do screencasting. We could do a video. We could do lecture capture. And we can even flip the classroom. One of the newer methods of teaching, flipping the classroom, involves removing direct instruction from the classroom via technology. In other words, why should we spend all of our time lecturing, which could really be done remotely? And if we do it remotely, then in class, for in-person, face-to-face instruction, we could use that time much better by engaging in the hands-on activities, which are very engaging for students. But second of all, that's where they really need guidance and mentoring and help, and will also develop questions. Probably not as much during the lecture. Even if a teacher does not choose to flip his or her classroom, there's a growing trend in which lecture is changing. Lecture is still an important means of disseminating information and delivering content, but lecture or direct instruction is changing to and morphing into micro lecture. So instead of like a 45-minute lecture or so, it's evolving into a 5 to 10-minute lecture with much more hands-on engagement in the classroom. Instructional design can be applied in many different locations and settings. For example, in the corporate world and also in the military world. Companies need, in many cases, to provide either departmental or company-wide employee training. They may need training updates, such as safety updates. They may need initial training for onboarding of newly hired employees. There may be needs for training, which also happens in the classroom, for just-in-time training. In other words, there's a need that arises, and all of a sudden someone needs to learn a particular skill. So instructional design can be very useful in putting together an efficient training module to handle that. As new technologies arise and new methods of teaching become popular and are making their way into the public awareness, we find that in the traditional classroom, there's increased need for instructional design. For example, at times when a teacher does not want to just engage the entire class, but would rather work individually or in small groups with students, we can design as teachers. We can be instructional designers and design drill and practice activities. We could put together a module of training that can either explain or review a very focused topic and maybe even address that topic coming at it from a different point of view than the teacher did in the classroom. A teacher could, if he or she builds up a library, could have a prerequisite skill library where students who are a little fuzzy on their previous learning or understanding of material could go through a module to catch up and brush up. And as we've described already, the just-in-time skills, all of a sudden a need for a particular skill arises, that could be part of your library. And again, at the high end, a teacher could flip his or her classroom. As a profession, instructional design is broad, and there are a lot of different types of jobs that are open in this broad field. For example, instructional designers can function as project managers. They can be the designer. If it's computer-based training, they could be a programmer. They could be a graphics person to illustrate different topics within training. They can be the instructor. They could be the subject matter expert. And they can also serve as an evaluator of the educational prototype, of the module prototype, just to make sure that it is effective, and then make suggestions for how the designer can tweak it and improve it into the future. In addition, instructional designers can evaluate new technologies to find new and better ways to deliver instruction to students. Instructional designers can assist faculty in discovering new methods and ways to improve their instruction, and especially as our world moves more and more toward online instruction and training. Designers can train faculty and staff. They can research the use of technologies and their impact on how students really learn. They can create training materials. That's a whole position right there. And they can also be managers of new technologies on campus for instructional purposes. The benefits of instructional systematic design. We heard already how the military started using this and really helped develop this. And they had the need for this because they needed to facilitate standardized training that would be used by multiple trainers at numerous sites. So instructional design certainly helps and addresses that issue. Instructional design can better ensure the accomplishment of and the attainment of the instructional objectives and provide empirical evidence of the success of the learners. If you are currently a traditional classroom teacher, you too can benefit from instructional design information and knowledge. For example, you could use some of the elements and some of the techniques of that design in your day-to-day planning of face-to-face traditional classes. This field and our study of it can help you to and cause you to rethink every lesson that you're going to write after this course, because you're going to be challenged based on your newfound knowledge to build lessons based on steps and based on skills and based on research rather than just using the old textbook order of topics. And also, this will provide an effective way for you to use existing technology that's already in your classroom or your school. Since the 1940s, when the military used one basic model to start to fashion the idea of instructional design, many specific models of instructional design have arisen, and many of these models can be applied to very specific circumstances. Some of the primary models are, and most influential, are ADDIE, the Dick and Carey model, and also Robert Gagne's 9 significant instructional events model. During this week, after this class, we're going to examine some of these models in greater detail. For now, let's take a look at a representative model called the ADDIE model. The ADDIE model consists of these 5 steps: analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. The ADDIE model is really considered like the foundational basis for other models of instructional design. So pretty much they all boil down to at least these common steps, although some are much more involved. Let's take a closer look at some of these steps to get an opening idea of what they're about. When ADDIE talks about the analysis phase, they're talking about that front-end analysis that we've been referring to. They're talking about that heavy lifting, so to speak, at the very beginning. So we're looking specifically at items such as a needs analysis. So let's look at what the problem is so that we can propose a solution. Now, depending on the circumstance where you're looking at developing the training for, you might be looking at state standards, at different benchmarks. You could be looking at requirements for different exams. We could be looking at some problem or a performance issue in a workplace. You could give a pretest and determine what the need is. They're also talking about the content analysis. In other words, what are we going to teach, and specifically, what are the steps? Learner analysis. What are the learners like? Again, if you're a day-to-day teacher, you already know your learners. But how about if you don't know those learners? How about if you're not going to have much of an opportunity to really meet or interact with them? Learner analysis becomes very significant. How about the environment in which they're being trained, and where they work or where they go to school? We have to look at various aspects of the environment as well. After we perform a thorough analysis of the situation, ADDIE then suggests that we set about to design the instruction. Based on the analysis, we write objectives. We select media. We create practice and assessment. And notice that the assessment happens early in this process. When we look at the Dick and Carey model, we'll see very specifically how early this can take place and why it's important to set up that assessment early. So we look at organizing lessons and units, and again, looking at the method in which we're going to deliver that training or that education. The third letter in ADDIE refers to development phase. So in this phase, we're talking about producing different media, creating materials for the instructor or manuals for different instructors, prepare materials for the participants, for the learners, for the students. And also part of development is rehearsing the presentation. The I in the ADDIE model refers to implementation. So here we're talking about scheduling, we're talking about establishing communications, we're talking about the presentation of the material to the learners. Or actually in the first go-round, we're actually looking at presenting this to a sample group of learners or the test group of learners. And the final step that's referred to in ADDIE is evaluation. And evaluation takes many forms for an instructional designer. First, we want to make sure that the content that is being delivered is valid and is accurate and is effectively being communicated. So we may need to employ a subject matter expert. A prototype evaluation. So we have to do testing on the actual product itself. If we're doing something online, is it working effectively? Are there bugs in it? Does it work well? And finally, we have to look at how the learners are acquiring that material. Are they really learning this content? So notice that evaluation is a very big part, it's an integral part of this design process. And we're not just referring to an assessment or a test given at the end of learning. To summarize, in this video, we started to explore the origins of instructional design. What is it? Where did it come from? What are some of the basic components of instructional design? what are some of the benefits to you as either a teacher or a trainer. And then we finished by taking a look at a representative model, a model called the ADDIE model, one that contains at least all the basic components that are common to almost every model of instructional design.